May 23, 1945. Lüneburg, British-occupied Germany. The medical officer's finger slipped into Heinrich Himmler's mouth, probing for hidden contraband. For a fraction of a second, their eyes met. The British doctors wary, professional. The prisoners suddenly panicked, cornered. Then Himmler's jaw snapped shut with shocking violence. The doctor yanked his bitten finger back, shouting. Himmler's Adam's apple bobbed once. The cyanide capsule, concealed for days through checkpoint after checkpoint, through interrogation after interrogation, was finally where its owner had always intended it to go. 15 minutes later, the second most powerful man in the Third Reich lay dead on the floor of a converted school, his mouth agape, his spectacles askew, his life ending not with a trial or a noose, but with a chemical burn spreading through his viscera. The body would be buried in an unmarked grave on the Lüneburg Heath, location known only to British intelligence, to ensure no shrine could ever be erected. But death, as it turned out, was only the beginning of the Himmler story. For those who carried his name, his wife, his daughter, his brothers, and their descendants, the reckoning would last far longer than 15 minutes. The architect of the final solution had escaped justice. His family would spend decades living in his shadow. The capture that almost wasn't. The strange thing about Heinrich Himmler's capture, 3 days before his death, was how close he came to slipping through. On May 21, 1945, 2 British soldiers of the 51st Highland Division stood guard at a small bridge near Bremerwörde, northern Germany, performing the tedious work of screening refugees and displaced persons. Thousands crossed daily, former prisoners, fleeing civilians, desperate soldiers trying to get home. The guards had been told to watch for forged papers, particularly those bearing a specific stamp known to be used by the SS. When 3 men approached, 2 in long green overcoats, 1 in a dirty sergeant's uniform wearing an eye patch, the soldiers' suspicions flared immediately. The 2 well-dressed Germans kept glancing back at their companion as if checking he was keeping up. When asked for papers, the shabby sergeant presented documents identifying him as Heinrich Himmler, member of the secret field police. The documents bore the telltale stamp. All 3 were detained. Himmler had tried so hard to disappear. He had shaved his distinctive toothbrush mustache. He wore thick, horn-rimmed glasses instead of his usual rimless spectacles. The eye patch covered one eye entirely. For more than 2 weeks, he had moved through the chaos of defeated Germany, sleeping in ditches, eating what he could scrounge, the most hunted man in Europe, hiding in plain sight. His disguise might have worked. British intelligence had stopped thousands of SS men trying similar ruses, except for one ironic twist. The forged papers that were supposed to protect him bore a stamp created by his own organization. The British Guards had been specifically warned about that exact forgery. By the time Himmler reached British Second Army headquarters for interrogation, his nerve had broken. "I am Reich Minister Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS," he announced with something like pride, "and I want to talk to Eisenhower." The British sergeant who heard this reportedly quipped back, "And I'm Winston Churchill." But it was true. And when the medical officer, during what should have been a routine body search, reached toward Himmler's mouth, the Reichsführer SS made his final decision. Better death than testimony. Better silence than accountability. The chaos that followed, British officers turning Himmler upside down, plunging his head into cold water, one doctor threading a needle through his tongue, trying desperately to reach the poison in his gullet, was futile. Within minutes, Heinrich Himmler was dead at age 44. his secrets dying with him, his crimes documented but never confessed. His victims never granted the cold satisfaction of seeing him stand trial. But in Gmund am Tegernsee, in a villa beside a lake in the Bavarian Alps, his wife and 16-year-old daughter had only just begun to pay. The wife who wouldn't believe Margaret Himmler had last seen her husband in April 1945 at their home in Gmund, just weeks before everything collapsed. She was 51 years old, a nurse by training, a woman who had spent 17 years married to a man who called himself the most loyal man in Germany. In her letters, she wrote of Heinrich with reverence. How wonderful that he has been called to great tasks and is equal to them. Even as Berlin burned and refugees clogged the roads, Margaret, whom her husband called Marga, maintained a kind of willful blindness about what those great tasks had actually entailed. She had been born Margaret Boden in 1893 in Gonkarzewo near Bromberg, daughter of a landowner trained as a nurse during the First World War. She was 7 years older than Heinrich when they met in 1927 during one of his lecture tours for the fledgling Nazi movement. She owned a nursing clinic in Berlin. He was an unemployed chicken farmer with grandiose political ambitions. They married in July 1928. Her money bought them land near Munich, where they built a prefabricated house and tried, unsuccessfully, to raise livestock. When the Nazis seized power in 1933, everything changed. Margarete joined the party. Heinrich's career exploded. They moved to better addresses, first Munich, then Gmund am Tegernsee, where they purchased a large villa. Heinrich was constantly away on party business, rising through the SS hierarchy with terrifying speed. Margarete ran the household, managed their one biological daughter, Gudrun, and adopted a boy, Gerhard von der Ahe, whose SS officer father had died. She entertained the wives of other SS leaders, though they found her cold, hard, a chronic complainer. Heinrich began an affair with his secretary, Hedwig Potthast, in 1938. They separated informally in 1940, but never divorced. Hitler wouldn't approve. Hedwig bore Heinrich 2 more children, a son and a daughter he desperately wanted. Yet throughout all of this, Margaret remained loyal. Even when American forces arrested her and Gudrun in May 1945, even when she was interrogated repeatedly about the concentration camps, even when the evidence of Heinrich's crimes became undeniable, she clung to the belief that he had been fundamentally good, a patriot who did his duty. The Americans moved them between camps, first Italy, then through facilities in Rome and Florence, then France, then Germany. Conditions were harsh, severe rationing, constant interrogations, the weight of being associated with one of history's greatest criminals. Gudrun, devastated by her father's death, went on hunger strikes in Rome, growing weak and feverish. Margaret tried to protect her daughter while navigating her own shock and disbelief. In September 1945, Margaret was interrogated again during the Nuremberg trials. She and Gudrun were then detained at Flakkaserne Ludwigsburg internment camp, but because they themselves were not directly accused of crimes, they were released in November 1946, after a year and a half in custody. Freedom, however, brought no relief. They took refuge at the Bethel Institution in Bielefeld, a Protestant facility that offered shelter despite controversy. An article in the New York Tribune's European edition in June 1947 bore the headline, "Widow of Heinrich Himmler lives like a gentlewoman." Public outrage followed. How dare she live comfortably while millions mourned? Then came denazification proceedings. In 1948, Margaret was classified as Category 3, a lesser offender. She retained a lawyer to challenge this, claiming her Nazi Party membership had been merely nominal, that her high rank came from her Red Cross work, not ideology. The court wasn't convinced. Another proceeding began, initiated by Bavarian Prime Minister Hans Ehard, this one in the British occupation zone, focused on the unresolved ownership of their Gmund villa. On January 15, 1953, at a final hearing in Munich, the verdict came down. Margaret Himmler was Category 2, an activist, militant, and profiteer, one of the incriminated. She was sentenced to 30 days of punitive labor. She lost her pension rights. She lost the right to vote. All property was confiscated. For a woman who had once hosted SS wives in a lakeside villa, who had bought groceries with money earned from slave labor and genocide, who had signed her letters with Nazi salutes, the fall was complete. She lived her final years modestly, first with her sister Lydia in Hepen, starting in 1955, later with Gudrun in Munich. She died in 1967 at age 73, 22 years after her husband's suicide, maintaining until the end that Heinrich had been misunderstood, that history had judged him too harshly, that somehow he had been a good man caught in terrible times. She was buried quietly, without ceremony, another woman who loved a monster and could never admit what he was. The daughter who never wavered, Gudrun Margareta Elfriede Emma Anna Himmler, called Puppy, Dolly by her father, was born August 8, 1929. She was named after a character in a novel by her father's favorite writer. From her earliest memories, she was adored. Heinrich Himmler, architect of the Holocaust, administrator of death camps, chief of the SS and Gestapo, phoned his daughter almost every day when they were apart and visited whenever he could. He had her flown regularly from Munich to Berlin so she could spend hours with him. Adolf Hitler, whom Gudrun called Uncle Hitler, gave her dolls and chocolates every New Year. In 1941, when Gudrun was 12, her father took her to visit Dachau concentration camp. She wrote in her diary, "Today, we went to the SS concentration camp at Dachau. We saw everything we could. We saw the gardening work. We saw the pear trees. We saw all the pictures painted by the prisoners. Marvelous. And afterwards, we had a lot to eat. It was very nice." She saw the pear trees, not the prisoners dying of starvation, not the bodies in the crematorium yards away. She was 12, blonde, blue-eyed, the perfect Aryan child, beloved daughter of the man whose policies had created this hell, and she saw pear trees. When Germany collapsed in May 1945, 15-year-old Gudrun and her mother fled toward northern Italy, hoping to find safety in the chaos. Instead, American forces captured them. The interrogations began immediately. A British officer questioned young Gudrun about cremations at Dachau and Oranienburg. She responded with silence. What could she say? Her father had told her these places were work camps, rehabilitation centers, necessary security measures. She believed him absolutely. Internment lasted nearly 4 years. The camps, the hunger, the interrogations, the realization slowly creeping in that her father, her beloved puppy-calling father, was being described as one of history's greatest criminals. Other teenagers might have cracked, might have reconsidered, might have experienced the psychological break necessary to separate themselves from their parents' crimes. Gudrun Himmler never wavered. After release in 1949, she emerged hardened, radicalized by what she perceived as her mistreatment. While other Germans were attempting to build a new democratic society, Gudrun was cutting out every newspaper photo of her father, gluing them into a large scrapbook, building a shrine to his memory. She refused to believe he had committed suicide. Instead, she insisted for the rest of her life that he had been murdered by the British. One more crime against the misunderstood hero. In 1961, using an assumed name, she took a secretarial job with West Germany's Bundesnachrichtendienst, the BND, the Federal Intelligence Service. She worked at their Pullach headquarters near Munich for 2 years before her true identity was discovered in 1963. The agency, headed at the time by Reinhard Gehlen, an ex-Wehrmacht general who had recruited numerous ex-Nazis for their Eastern European connections and anti-communist expertise, quietly dismissed her. No scandal, no prosecution, just quiet removal of an embarrassment. She married Wolf-Dieter Burwitz, a far-right propagandist and writer who later became a party official with the extremist NPD. They had 2 children. She settled into a suburban existence in Munich, became a mother and grandmother, looked in photographs like any other elderly German woman waving goodbye to grandchildren after Sunday visits. But Gudrun Burwitz, she took her husband's surname, though she never stopped being a Himmler in spirit, was not any other elderly German woman. She was, by most accounts, the leading figure in Stille Hilfe, Silent Help, an organization founded after the war explicitly to aid former SS members evade justice. Silent Help operated for decades in the shadows of German society. It provided financial assistance, legal support, false papers, housing, and escape routes to South America for war criminals on the run. Klaus Barbie, the butcher of Lyon, responsible for the torture and murder of thousands, received their assistance. So did Martin Sommer, the hangman of Buchenwald. So did Anton Maloth, who brutalized prisoners at Theresienstadt. Gudrun Burwitz worked tirelessly, attending meetings well into her 80s, a fixture at Silent Help gatherings, sometimes called the Nazi Princess, by supporters and detractors alike. She never recanted, never apologized, never acknowledged that the man who called her Puppy and gave her toys and flew her to Berlin and took her to see pear trees at Dachau was responsible for the systematic murder of 6 million Jews and millions of other victims. When journalists approached her, she either stayed silent or defended him. When historians documented his crimes, she dismissed them as Allied propaganda. When fellow Germans attempted to reckon with the past, she worked to help those who refused. Gudrun Burwitz died on May 24, 2018, in or near Munich, at age 88. Her death was first reported by the German newspaper Bild. There was no public funeral, no memorial. Her family maintained their privacy. The woman who had spent 73 years defending one of history's greatest mass murderers simply ceased to exist, leaving behind 2 children, several grandchildren, and a legacy of willful, defiant, unshakable denial. She saw pear trees until the very end, the brothers who chose different paths. Heinrich Himmler was the second of 3 brothers, born into a respectable, middle-class Catholic family in Munich. Their father, Joseph Gebhard Himmler, taught Greek and Latin at a humanistic gymnasium. Their mother, Anna Maria Haider, raised them with strict propriety. It was, by all accounts, an ordinary upbringing. How does such a family produce the architect of genocide? And what happened to the brothers who shared that childhood, but not that fate? Gebhard Ludwig Himmler, born July 29, 1898, was the eldest. He served in World War I, saw combat on the Western Front at Château Thierry, earned the Iron Cross, became a lieutenant. When the war ended, he and Heinrich both joined the paramilitary Freikorps, that breeding ground for right-wing extremism. Gebhard participated in the Beer Hall Putsch in November 1923, marching alongside his brother and Ernst Röhm. But while Heinrich was radicalizing into a fanatic, Gebhard was studying mechanical engineering at the Technical University of Munich, building a more conventional career. By the time the Nazis seized power in 1933, Gebhard had found his niche. He joined the Nazi Party in May that year, late enough to avoid being seen as an opportunist, early enough to benefit from his brother's rising power. He requested that his wife's lower party number be transferred to him. He worked in Nazi educational administration, became a director in the Reich Education Ministry, helped define guidelines for engineering certifications. It was bureaucratic work, technical work, the kind that could be defended later as merely professional. But Gebhard was no innocent bystander. He joined the SS in 1944, reaching the rank of SS Standartenführer, and worked as an inspector of Waffen-SS schools. He lived with his younger brother Ernst in Berlin from August 1943 onward. His wife Hilde and their family stayed sometimes at Haus Lindenficht in Gmund am Tegernsee, the same villa where Margarete Himmler supervised prisoners from a Dachau subcamp during renovation work. Gebhard knew. He benefited. He participated. When the war ended, he was captured by the British and interned until 1948. At the Nuremberg trials, he was called to testify about his notorious brother. His testimony was extraordinary in its loyalty. He described Heinrich as having deep kindness, called him upright, simple, and true to his path. He told the tribunal, "Personally, I would never see my brother as the culprit of those things." Denazification proceedings classified Gebhard as Category 2, follower incriminated, but he successfully appealed, eventually regaining his pension rights. He lived quietly for decades, working with the European Afghan Cultural Office in Munich as a study advisor for Afghan students, dying on June 22, 1982, at age 83. He was buried with his wife Hilde in Munich's Waldfriedhof. His grave remains, a testament to the ability of complicit men to build ordinary lives after extraordinary crimes. Ernst Hermann Himmler, the youngest brother, born December 23, 1905, took a different path initially, then ended up even more deeply entangled. An electrical engineer by training, Ernst joined the Nazi Party on November 1, 1931, before Hitler took power. In 1933, he joined the SS. With Heinrich's help, he got a job with Berlin Radio, eventually becoming director within the Reich Broadcasting Organization, reaching the rank of SS Sturmbannführer by 1939. Ernst was no passive technocrat. He organized the flawless broadcasts of the Nuremberg Party rallies, the 1936 Olympic Games, the Anschluss following the invasion of Czechoslovakia. His wife, Gertrude Paula Melters, called Heinrich "Dear Heini," and benefited when Heinrich gave her brother Walter a position in the SS. Ernst supplied Heinrich with internal information from the broadcasting world, intelligence on who said what, who might be disloyal, who needed watching. When American journalist and researcher Katrin Himmler, Ernst's granddaughter, investigated her family history decades later, she discovered something her relatives had always denied. Ernst was no unwilling participant dragged along by his infamous brother. He was an enthusiastic Nazi from early on, a true believer who used his position to advance the regime's propaganda. Ernst never lived to face denazification. On May 2, 1945, just days after Hitler's suicide, Ernst Himmler died fighting with the Volkssturm in Berlin. He was 39 years old. Whether he died believing in the Thousand-Year Reich or realizing it had all been for nothing, no one knows. His body was likely never properly identified, lost in the rubble of a city where tens of thousands died in the final desperate battles. Three brothers. One became the architect of the final solution. One testified to his kindness at Nuremberg. One died in the ruins of Berlin, defending a regime that had murdered millions. The shadow that Heinrich cast was long, but his brothers were never entirely outside its reach. They chose how close to stand to that shadow, and every choice mattered. The descendant who spoke out decades past. Germany rebuilt. The economy boomed. Democracy took root. The generation that had lived through the Nazi era aged and died. Their children struggled with inherited guilt. And then came the grandchildren, born in the 1960s and 70s, growing up in a country that taught the Holocaust in schools, that memorialized the victims, that had reckoned, however imperfectly, with its past. Catherine Himmler was born in 1967, granddaughter of Ernst Hermann Himmler, great-niece of Heinrich Himmler. She grew up in Spain and southern Germany. Her parents bombarded her and her sister with enlightened literature about National Socialism from an early age, but they never discussed it much. The information was there. The emotional processing was left to the children. When Catherine was 11, she watched the 1978 American TV series Holocaust. She had nightmares for days. In school, a teacher once asked if anyone had family involved in the Nazi regime. Catherine stammered, "Yes." The classroom fell into deathly silence. The teacher, embarrassed and unsure, quickly moved on. As she grew older, Catherine gave her family history a wide berth. It was easier not to know, easier not to ask, easier not to think about what it meant to carry that name. Then she fell in love with an Israeli man, Danny in her writings, whose family had been confined to the Warsaw Ghetto. They married. They had a son who was half Jewish, raised in Berlin, carrying the DNA of both victims and perpetrators. And Catherine realized she could no longer evade the past. She began researching. She requested documents, letters, diaries. Her family had always insisted that Ernst had no interest in politics, that Gebhard was just an engineer, that only Heinrich had been truly guilty. What Catherine discovered shocked her. Ernst had joined the party in 1931, enthusiastically. He had been an SS officer. When a half-Jewish colleague at the radio needed protection, Ernst refused to help. Gebhard had changed the date of his Nazi Party membership to make it seem he'd been an early supporter. Both brothers had profited enormously from Heinrich's power. Both had known what was happening. Both had participated in ways large and small. Many times during my research, it was quite difficult for me to go on, Catherine told an interviewer in August 2007. Reading her grandfather Gebhard's testimony at Nuremberg, the description of Heinrich's deep kindness, the refusal to see him as culpable, was particularly devastating. Her relatives didn't want to hear what she was uncovering. Some stopped talking to her. One of Gebhard's daughters initially cooperated, then cut off contact when she realized how deep Catherine was digging. In 2005, Catherine published Die Brüder Himmler, eine deutsche Familiengeschichte, the Himmler Brothers, a German family history, with S. Fischer Verlag. The book traced the lives of all three brothers, showing how National Socialism inspired Gebhard and Ernst from an early age, how the family profited from Heinrich's rise, how ordinary middle-class Germans became complicit in genocide. Reviewers praised the book's level-headedness. Doug Johnston wrote in The List magazine, "Catherine's book is admirably level-headed, a meticulous memoir of an extraordinary family, and the author never resorts to histrionics, preferring to let the facts speak for themselves." But there was also criticism. Robert Hawkes in The Independent noted, "Katrin does try to turn some equivocal evidence into revelations of her family's complicity, but her prosecutorial stance gets in the way of empathy." Katrin didn't write the book for critics. She wrote it for her son, so he would understand his heritage completely. She wrote it because breaking the family tradition of silence felt necessary. She wrote it because carrying the name Himmler, she deliberately kept it rather than taking her husband's surname, meant confronting what that name represented. In 2011, she appeared in the documentary Hitler's Children by Israeli director Chanoch Ze'evi, joining other descendants of Nazi perpetrators in examining how they lived with their inherited legacy. In 2014, she and historian Michael Wild published Himmler Privat, Briefe eines Massenmörders, Himmler Private, Letters of a Mass Murderer, newly discovered letters between Heinrich and Margarete from 1927 to 1933 and 1940 to 1945, supplemented by Margaret's and Gudrun's diaries. "Meanwhile, I know these are such damn normal people, and that's the scary thing," Katrin said in an interview. That was her central discovery, the thing that kept her going despite the difficulty. The Himmlers weren't monsters in every aspect of their lives. They were educated, middle-class, respectable Germans who loved their families, wrote affectionate letters, worried about everyday concerns, and simultaneously embraced an ideology that led to industrialized genocide. Katrin lives in Berlin with her son. She has dedicated much of her professional life to studying racism and interculturality. She speaks publicly about her family's history. She represents a different choice than Gudrun Burwitz made, not denial and defiance, but acknowledgement and education. Both women were shaped by Heinrich Himmler's legacy. Both carried his DNA. Both heard family stories. But where Gudrun saw pear trees and remained devoted to her father's memory, Katrin saw the truth and chose a different inheritance. The Shadow's Length. On May 23, 2018, 73 years to the day after Heinrich Himmler bit down on his cyanide capsule, Gudrun Burwitz died in Munich. The symmetry was noted by historians but ignored by most Germans, who had long since moved on from the Nazi era, or so they liked to believe. But shadows have a way of persisting, especially shadows cast by men who murdered 6 million Jews and orchestrated the deaths of millions more. The Himmler family's story reveals something uncomfortable about complicity, about loyalty, about the ways ordinary people navigate extraordinary evil. Margaret Himmler chose denial. Even after losing everything, her home, her husband, her social standing, her rights, she couldn't admit what Heinrich had done. She died believing he had been misunderstood, that history would eventually correct itself, that somehow he had been essentially good. Her denial was complete, unshakable, maintained across decades of evidence. Gudrun Burwitz chose defiance. She turned her denial into activism, spending 73 years defending her father's reputation and actively helping other SS men evade justice. She became the living embodiment of unrepentant Nazi loyalty, a woman who looked at all the evidence, the testimony, the documents, the photographs from the camps, and saw only pear trees. Her 2 children and several grandchildren carry that legacy forward into the 21st century, their names and lives deliberately shielded from public scrutiny. Gebhard Himmler chose survival through selective memory. He testified to Heinrich's kindness at Nuremberg, rehabilitated his own reputation through denazification appeals, lived quietly for nearly 4 more decades, and was buried with full dignity. He represents the thousands of German officials who were complicit but not notorious, who participated but didn't lead, who benefited enormously from crimes they claimed not to fully understand. Ernst Himmler chose full participation and died before facing consequences. He was an early enthusiast, a true believer, a man who used his technical skills in service of propaganda and genocide. His death in Berlin spared him from the reckoning his brothers faced. And Katrin Himmler chose confrontation. She did the difficult work of uncovering what her family had done, publishing it, speaking about it, using her inherited name as a tool for education rather than a burden to hide. She married a man whose family had been victimized by the regime her great-uncle led. She raised a son to understand all of his heritage. She represents the possibility, however difficult, however incomplete, of breaking cycles of silence and complicity. The question that haunts all of this is, how much responsibility does family bear for the crimes of their relatives? Margaret and Gudrun weren't in the camps themselves, didn't operate the gas chambers, didn't shoot prisoners into mass graves. But they lived well on the proceeds of those crimes. They enjoyed social status because of them. They defended the perpetrators and, in Gudrun's case, actively helped them escape justice. Gebhard and Ernst participated more directly, but in respectable roles: education, broadcasting, technical support. They weren't executioners, but the machine they served couldn't have functioned without people like them. Their ordinariness, their professionalism, their technical competence, these weren't defenses. They were the mechanism of genocide itself. The Himmler family's fate, after May 23, 1945, wasn't execution or imprisonment or dramatic punishment. It was something more subtle and perhaps more terrible. It was having to live in a world that knew what they were, what they had done or failed to do, what they had benefited from. Some embraced that burden honestly. Others spent their lives fleeing from it, or denying it, or doubling down on defending it. Today, the name Himmler still carries weight. Researchers still study the letters Margarete and Heinrich exchanged, looking for insights into how ordinary people embrace extraordinary evil. Historians still debate Gebhard's testimony at Nuremberg, Ernst's enthusiasm for the regime, Gudrun's lifetime of denial. Educators use Katrin's books and interviews to explore questions of inherited guilt and chosen responsibility. And somewhere in Munich, Gudrun Berwitz's children and grandchildren live their lives, carrying a name their grandmother never renounced, defending a legacy she spent 88 years protecting. They wave goodbye after family visits, looking in photographs like any other German family. But they are not any other German family. They are the descendants of Heinrich Himmler, architect of the Holocaust, and that fact, however much they might wish otherwise, defines them still. The shadow remains. The question is, what do you do when you find yourself standing in it? Deny it, like Margaret? Defend it like Gudrun? Quietly accommodate it like Gebhard? Die still believing it like Ernst? Or shine a light into it like Katrin, examining uncomfortable truths about heritage and complicity and the ways families transmit not just genes, but choices, not just names, but responsibilities. The Third Reich lasted 12 years. The reckoning has lasted 8 decades and counting. And for the family of Heinrich Himmler, the man who died with cyanide burning through his system, on May 23, 1945, the reckoning will last as long as memory itself endures, a shadow stretching forward through generations, asking the same question over and over: what will you do with this inheritance? What will you do with this name? The answer, it turns out, matters more than any of them imagined.